Good evening. My name is Dave Warren. I'm the clinical herbalist at the New Mexico Herbal Clinic. Tonight, we are going to be discussing the medical uses of marijuana throughout history, and some of the things we'll discover will astonish and disturb you. So let's get started right now. Welcome to a history of marijuana and CBD as medicine. For centuries, marijuana and its cannabinoids have been used as medicine. With the emergence of the AMA and Big Pharma, a movement began to outlaw the use of the plant, citing it as everything from poison to a gateway drug. Now, as we enter the year 2021, research has shown how wrong the AMA, the League of Nations, the federal government, and doctors were. Medical marijuana and CBD, CBN, CBG, and THC have helped millions live a better life. Imagine how many more would have had a healthier lifestyle if the above group of naysayers had been silenced, or if they had actually studied the history of this beneficial herb. Here is that history with sources cited. The Chinese Emperor Fu Sai, around 2900 BC, whom the Chinese credit with bringing civilization to China, seems to have made reference to Ma, the Chinese word for cannabis, noting that cannabis was a very popular medicine that possessed both yin and yang. In 2700 BC, according to legend, the Emperor Shenyang, also known as Chenyang, considered the father of Chinese medicine, discovered marijuana's healing properties as well as those of two other mainstays of Chinese herbal medicine, ginseng and ephedra. In 1500 BC, we have the earliest written reference to medical marijuana in a Chinese pharmacopoeia. The use of cannabis for purpose of healing predates recorded history. In 1450 BC, the book of Exodus in the Bible references a holy anointing oil made from cannabis. And I know this will set some of you on edge, but here's the proof. Holy anointing oil, as described in the original Hebrew version of the recipe in Exodus 30, 22, and 23, contained over 6 pounds of kennebosum, a substance identified by respected etymologists, linguistics, anthropologists, botanists, and other researchers as cannabis, extracted into about 6 quarts of olive oil, along with a variety of other fragrant herbs. This ancient anointed ones were literally drenched with this potent mixture. Marijuana proponents suggest that the recipe for the anointing oil passed from God to Moses and included cannabis. They point to versions calling for fragrant cane, which they say was mistakenly changed to the plant calamus in the King James Version of the Bible. In 1213 BC, it is known that Egyptians used cannabis for glaucoma, inflammation, and enemas. Cannabis pollen is found on the mummy of Ramses II, who died in 1213 BC. Prescriptions for cannabis in ancient Egypt included treatment for the eyes, glaucoma, inflammation, and cooling the uterus, as well as being administered in enemas. In 1000 BC, bhang, a drink of cannabis and milk, was used in India as an anesthetic. It was also used to treat a wide variety of human illnesses. In 700 BC, the medical use of marijuana in the Middle East is recorded in the Venedad. And the Venedad is one of the volumes of ancient Persian religious beliefs. And it's a text written around the 7th century BC, purportedly by Zoroaster, the founder of Zoroastrianism, and heavily influenced by the Vedas, mentioning bhang and it lists cannabis as the most important of 10,000 medical plants. In 600 BC, Indian medicine treatise cites cannabis as a cure for leprosy. In 200 BC, medical cannabis is used in ancient Greece, and it was used for a wide variety of illnesses, including earache, edema, and inflammation. In 1 AD, an ancient Chinese text recommends marijuana for more than 100 ailments. Those ailments include, and are not limited to, gout, rheumatism, malaria, and absent-mindedness. Now we get to the crux of an issue. Was Jesus a pothead? Well, in the Bible's New Testament, Jesus anointed his disciples with a potent psychoactive substance, oil, sending out the 12 apostles to do the same around the year 30 AD. Likewise, after Jesus' passing, James suggests that anyone of the Christian community who was sick should call on the elders to anoint them with oil in the name of Jesus. So, did Jesus actually use cannabis? I think so. The word Christ does mean the anointed one, and Bennett contends that Christ was anointed with chrism, a cannabis-based oil that caused his spiritual visions. The ancient recipe for this oil, as we have already seen, is recorded in Exodus, with over 9 pounds of flowering cannabis tops, extracted into about 11 pints of olive oil with a variety of other herbs. In 70 AD, Roman medical texts cited cannabis in the treatment of earaches and to suppress sexual longing. And Pliny the Elder wrote about medicinal properties of the cannabis plant. He wrote that the roots of the plant boiled in water ease cramped joints, gout, too, and similar violent pain. In 200 AD, a Chinese surgeon actually performed surgeries using cannabis resin and wine as an anesthetic. Those surgeries included organ grafts, resectioning of intestines, incisions into the loin, and incisions into the chest. And cannabis was used as medicine in the Arabic world. By some, however, others labeled it a lethal poison. Cannabis was used medicinally across the Arabic world in Roman times, and applied to a wide variety of ailments from migraines to syphilis, and as an analgesic and an anesthetic. However, there were some who warned that the potential effects of hashish could be a lethal poison. In 1500, Muslim doctors began using marijuana to reduce sexuality. And they used the Persian theories to guide their use of cannabis. Their applications tended to stress the late effects rather than the early ones. So they used it, for instance, as a means of reducing sexuality rather than increasing it. This is an interesting note. Cannabis can be used for both. In 1538, hemp was central to any herbalist medicine cabinet. William Turner, the naturalist considered the first English botanist, praised it in his New Herbal, published in 1538. In 1578, Chinese medical texts described even more medical uses for marijuana, including vomiting, parasitic infections, and hemorrhaging. Marijuana continues to be used in China as a folk remedy for diarrhea and dysentery, as well as to help stimulate the appetite. William Shakespeare may also have been a pothead. In the South African Journal of Science, it was reported that the results of chemical analyses of plant residues in tobacco pipes from Stratford-upon-Avon and the environs, dating back to the early 17th century, the pipe bowls and stems had been obtained by Thackeray on loan from the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust in Stratford-upon-Avon. Several of the pipes had been excavated from the garden of William Shakespeare. Results of this study, which included 24 pipe fragments, indicated cannabis in 8 samples, nicotine from tobacco leaves, the kind associated with Sir Walter Raleigh, in at least 1 sample, and in 2 samples, definite evidence of Peruvian cocaine. Thackeray suggests that Shakespeare preferred cannabis as a stimulant, which had mind-stimulating properties. Well, I guess that's not so much ado about nothing. From 1611 to 1762, the Jamestown settlers brought marijuana to North America. In fact, it was so important that Virginia awarded bounties for hemp culture and manufacture and imposed penalties on those who did not produce it. In 1621, the popular English mental health book recommended cannabis to treat depression. It's still used for that today in many parts of the world. English clergyman and Oxford scholar Robert Burton suggested cannabis as a treatment for depression in his influential and still popular 1621 book, The Anatomy of Melancholy. In 1652, herbalist Nicholas Culpeper wrote about medical uses for hemp. He noted that it eased the pains of gout, knots in the joints, and the pains of the sinews and hips. Culpeper's preparation probably had little psychoactivity, as native cannabis grown in northern latitudes had relatively low THC content. What's interesting to note, however, is that it would have had a very high CBD content, something we are all familiar with today. In 1745 through 1775, for a period of 30 years, George Washington grew hemp at Mount Vernon, his plantation. According to his agricultural ledgers, he had particular interest in the medicinal use of cannabis, and several of his diary entries indicate that he indeed was growing cannabis with a high THC content. That's marijuana. Thomas Jefferson also grew hemp at his Monticello. Jefferson did grow hemp, but there's no evidence to suggest that he was a habitual smoker of hemp, tobacco, or any other substance. So, although we know he grew it, we don't know if he actually went one toke over the line. In 1799, Napoleon's forces brought marijuana from Egypt to France. And once it got there, the cannabis was investigated for its pain-relieving and sedative effects in Europe and became more widely accepted in Western medicine. In 1840, medical marijuana came to the United Kingdom via William O'Shaughnessy and was reportedly used by Queen Victoria for menstrual cramps. It was administered by mouth, not by smoking, and usually in the form of a tincture, which is an extract in alcohol. Cannabis extracts were incorporated into many different proprietary medicines, It was used to promote uterine contractions in childbirth, as a sedative to induce sleep, as a relief from period pains, muscle spasms, rheumatism, and the convulsions of tetanus, rabies, and epilepsy. Some of those are still treated with CBD today. In the 19th century, marijuana emerged as a mainstream medicine in the West. Studies in the 1840s by a French doctor by the name of Joseph Moreau, a French psychiatrist, found that marijuana suppressed headaches, increased appetites, and aided people in getting to sleep. In 1850, marijuana had made its way into the United States Pharmacopoeia, an official publication setting authority for all prescriptions and over-the-counter medicines, which listed marijuana as a treatment for numerous afflictions, including neuralgia, tetanus, typhoid, cholera, rabies, dysentery, alcoholism, opiate addiction, anthrax, leprosy, incontinence, gout, convulsive disorders, tonsillitis, insanity, excessive menstrual bleeding, and uterine bleeding, among others. Patented marijuana tinctures were also sold. And what's interesting to note here is that it took the United States until 1850 to actually include this in its pharmacopoeia, even though, as we have seen, for thousands of years before, people had been using it and discovering all of these maladies that could be assisted or cured simply by using marijuana. The British Lancet, which was and still is one of the world's leading medical journals, in 1889 outlined the application of cannabis for the treatment of opium and chloral hydrate withdrawal symptoms. The mixture reduced the opium craving and acted as an antiemetic, a drug that is usually effective against vomiting and nausea. In 1893 and 1894, the Indian Hemp Commission mentioned several medical uses of cannabis. Those included hay fever, cholera, dysentery, gonorrhea, diabetes, impotence, urinary incontinence, swelling of the testicles, granulation of open sores, and chronic ulcers. Other beneficial effects attributed to cannabis were prevention of insomnia, relief of anxiety, protection against cholera, alleviation of hunger, and as an aid to concentration of attention. In 1900, cannabis was used for asthma, bronchitis, and loss of appetite in South Asia. It was one of the more important drugs in the Indian Matera Medica at the turn of the century. It was, and still is, widely used in rural areas of the Indian subcontinent, what we call South Asia, and it's still used for asthma, bronchitis, and loss of appetite. In 1906, we begin the era of banning marijuana. The Pure Food and Drug Act required labeling of medicine, including cannabis. And it seemed that that was rather innocuous and really not too stringent. But we're going to see how quickly the United States began outlawing the very medicine that came from nature that had already helped millions of people for thousands of years. In 1911, Massachusetts became the first state to outlaw cannabis. Much of this was pushed because in 1914 and 1916, alcohol prohibition initiatives would make the state ballot. And the legislature was tackling moral issues such as prostitution, racetrack gambling, prize fighting, liquor, and oral sex. And so they threw in cannabis. Maine, Wyoming, and Indiana banned it in 1913, New York City in 1914, Utah and Vermont in 1915, Nevada in 1917. As in California, these laws were passed not due to any widespread use or concern about cannabis, but as regulatory initiatives to discourage future use. This was also the same time frame when Rockefeller was planning on initiating a report that would outlaw all alternative medicine schools within the United States and give him exclusive rights over big pharmaceutical companies because he manufactured the one thing they needed to operate: oil. As we said, in 1911, Massachusetts outlawed cannabis. In 1915, President Wilson signs the Harrison Act, which did not outlaw marijuana, but it became the model for drug regulation on the federal level and is considered the very basis for the Marijuana Tax Act of 1937. 1915 to 1927, 10 additional states passed marijuana prohibition laws, and you can read them right there. In 1918, oddly, U.S. pharmaceutical farms grew up to 60,000 pounds of marijuana annually. Up to World War I, pharmaceutical supplies of cannabis were entirely imported from India, in accordance with the U.S. Pharmacopedia, which specified that it come from the flowering tops of the Indian variety. But in 1913, the U.S. Department of Agriculture Bureau of Plant Industry announced that it had succeeded in growing domestic cannabis of equal quality to the Indian. When foreign supplies were interrupted by World War I, the United States became self-sufficient in cannabis. By 1918, some 60,000 pounds were being produced annually, all from pharmaceutical farms east of the Mississippi. And this begs the question, if states were outlawing it, why were we growing so much of it? In 1925, the League of Nations signed a multilateral treaty restricting cannabis use to scientific and medical use only. And here we get into the crux of the issue, which many in the United States still face today. The League of Nations multilateral treaty gave governments the right to grow and determine who could use marijuana. And restrictions on importing and exporting cannabis resin, or hashish, are put into place at this time. This was the first multilateral treaty to ever deal with cannabis. And in the 1930s, of course, money could be made by American pharmaceutical firms who began selling extracts of marijuana as medicine, despite the fact it was outlawed in almost every state by this time. The two biggest ones making money off of this, Park Davis and Eli Lilly, both still in business and both still gouging people with their high prescription costs. In 1930, Harry Anslinger was appointed the Commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics. Narcos, remember them from the 60s and 70s? And so, Anslinger, who became the architect of national prohibition, felt that narcotics were really bad, especially marijuana, and his case rested on two fantastical assertions: that the drug called insanity, which it actually helped cure, and that it pushed people towards horrendous acts of criminality. Sadly, he had no facts to back this up, but it didn't matter. He worked for the federal government. William Randolph Hearst, also well known to be in the pocket of many, many federal senators, congressmen, and even presidents, decided that the word hemp should be removed from newspapers and replaced with marijuana, and he would publish sensationalistic stories that linked violent acts to cannabis consumption. However, none of them were true. In 1936, the Bureau of Narcotics urged federal action to control marijuana. Anslinger maintained that all drug use was a plot of civic corruption, a public enemy seeking to destroy the community. During the 1936, the Bureau headlined the marijuana danger in its report, Traffic and Opium and Other Dangerous Drugs. And I want you to keep in mind, traffic in opium, because that's going to be important pretty soon, and other dangerous drugs, which included marijuana. In 1936, new medications supplanted marijuana as a treatment for pain. Hey folks, guess what they contained? Morphine and other opium-derived drugs. That's right. The same thing that Anslinger said was bad was now good, but marijuana was still bad. And then 1936 hit, and reefer madness hit the screen. Reefer madness is a morality tale of how reefer addiction ruins the life of its young protagonist and gets a lot of other people killed, sexually compromised, and committed to lunatic asylums. Actually, all of that's incorrect, and it was financed by a small church group. Wow, there's a shock. I wonder if that church group actually knew that Jesus was a pothead, or that Moses doused his priests with cannabis oil. It, of course, is a cult classic today, dwarfed only by the Rocky Horror Picture Show. And reefer madness is now a bona fide catchphrase, despite the fact everything in it is completely false. In 1937, for the first and probably the only time in its history, the American Medical Association opposed a proposed Marijuana Tax Act and supported research on medical cannabis. That was a lot of lip service, and it really didn't help. And even today, the AMA still poo-poos all of the proven facts on how cannabis can help. The federal government actually passed the Marijuana Tax Act in October of 1937. After the passage of that act, prescriptions of marijuana by doctors declined dramatically because they decided it was easier not to prescribe marijuana than to deal with all the extra work imposed by the new law. And quite frankly, that's exactly why the law was passed. October the 2nd, 1937, there's Samuel R. Caldwell, the first marijuana seller convicted under U.S. federal law. On the day the Marijuana Tax Stamp Act was enacted, the FBI and Denver, Colorado police raided the Lexington Hotel and arrested Caldwell. Wow, I wonder if they were watching him. I mean, it happened on the very day the act was passed. They also arrested Moses Baca, his customer. So Caldwell went into history trivia as the first marijuana seller convicted under U.S. federal law. And his customer Baca, he was found guilty of possession. Caldwell was sentenced to 4 years of hard labor in Leavenworth and a $1,000 fine, Baca received 18 months incarceration. Both men served every single day of their sentence, and a year after Caldwell was released from prison, he died. In 1942, marijuana was removed from the U.S. Pharmacopeia. There was no reason given other than the fact that it was helping people, it was really cheap, and pharmaceutical companies couldn't make a lot of money from it. And guess who helped remove it? Yep, the American Medical Association. However, from 1938 to 1944, Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia did a commission that looked at all of these things that were said about marijuana and found out they were wrong. Here's what the LaGuardia report concluded. The practice of smoking marijuana does not lead to addiction in the medical sense of the word. The use of marijuana does not lead to morphine or heroin or cocaine addiction, and no effort is made to create a market for these narcotics by stimulating the practice of marijuana smoking. Marijuana is not the determining factor in the commission of major crimes. The publicity concerning the catastrophic effects of marijuana smoking in New York City is unfounded. But that didn't do much for the big pharma companies, so the federal government kept pushing. And in 1951, the Boggs Act established minimum prison sentences for simple possession. Congress established a mandatory minimum prison sentence for drug crimes. It was named for its sponsor, Representative Hale Boggs, a Democrat from Louisiana. It imposed a 2 to 5 year minimum sentence for first offenses, including simple possession, and it made no distinction between drug users and drug traffickers for the purposes of sentencing. The driving force behind the Boggs Act was a mistaken belief that drug addiction was a contagious and incurable disease, and that addicts should be quarantined and forced to undergo treatment. Folks, this is 1951, and our Congress actually thought that marijuana or drug addiction of any kind was a contagious and incurable disease. Oh my God, who elected these people? In 1964, THC, the main psychoactive component of cannabis, was first identified and then synthesized at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. It's also the first to identify delta-9 THC as the main psychoactive component. So remember, all this time the federal government is telling all of the citizens how bad marijuana is and how it just doesn't do anything other than drive people insane, leads to sexual deprivation. It does all kinds of terrible things. Oddly, though, in 1968, the University of Mississippi holds a registration from the DEA to cultivate marijuana for government use and research activities. Now, if they think it's this bad, why is the government using marijuana? And why are they researching it? Wasn't it bad? That's what they were telling everybody. This is 1968, folks, not that long ago. Also in 1968, President Johnson created the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. And here's what he said. The dramatic increase in the use of marijuana and other drugs during the later 1960s was a matter of high public visibility. So, in response, Johnson offered Reorganization Plan Number 1. It was effective on April the 8th, 1968, and placed the Federal Bureau of Narcotics and the Bureau of Drug Abuse Control, or FDA, in the Department of Justice and designated it the Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. However, in 1968, over the pond in Great Britain, the UK Wharton report finds cannabis was less dangerous than alcohol. Actually, they said the long-term consumption of cannabis in moderate doses has no harmful effects. Cannabis is less dangerous than the opiates, amphetamines, and barbiturates, and also less dangerous than alcohol. The report's influence is seen in future British drug policies that reduced penalties for possession of marijuana by 50%. So on this slide, I'm not going to read it all to you because it goes through some of the new laws that came out in the 70s that also enhanced all the laws that the federal government had passed prior to that. But I'll leave it up for a few moments so you can read it. Hey, it's Tricky Dick. And on June the 17th, 1971, good old President Nixon declared his war on drugs. He said that America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. Well, isn't America and the United States the same place? Anyway, he also said in order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new, all-out offensive. I have asked Congress to provide the legislative authority and the funds to fuel this kind of an offense. This will be a worldwide offensive dealing with the problems of sources of supply as well as any Americans who may be stationed abroad, wherever they are in the world. Yep, Tricky Dick brought in Dr. Jaffe to the White House, directly reporting to him as a special consultant to the president for narcotics and dangerous drugs. So apparently those guys that broke into Watergate a few years down the road, they weren't high at all. They knew exactly what they were doing. In 1972, however, the National Commission on Marijuana and Drug Abuse, this is the Schaefer Commission, recommended all marijuana should be decriminalized. Yeah, but Nixon wasn't going for that. He just thought it was bad. Or maybe it was bad politics to piss off Big Pharma. 74, the NIDA placed in charge of contracts to grow marijuana for research purposes. So while we're having this great war on drugs and we're imposing mandatory minimum sentences for a small amount of marijuana, in fact, no matter how big an amount, you're going to do 3 to 5. The government is growing it for research purposes. One has to question what the hell they're researching if they don't believe it has any beneficial properties. 1976, there he is, Robert Randall. He takes the federal government to court after he's been arrested for simple possession. And the court rules that his use of marijuana for glaucoma is a medical necessity. Oh my God, it actually works? It helps glaucoma? Who would have thought? Oh wait, yeah, the Chinese, the Indian people, the Europeans, oh heck, even the Americans, up until a certain point. Wow. For the next 25 years, the federal government held to the belief that marijuana and all cannabinoids were bad, despite centuries of evidence that we have already seen now to the contrary. Slowly, states began passing medical marijuana bills, challenging the federal government and big pharmaceutical companies to attack them. Despite raids on dispensaries by federal DEA agents, states continued to defy the federal government. So, exactly when did the feds back down? Well, you've probably figured it out by now. It was when a pharmaceutical company asked for approval of a marijuana-based drug. Yep. Look at that date, folks. We're in 2021. This was 2018. The FDA approved its first marijuana-based drug. And the press release simply stated, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration today, June 25, 2018, approved cannabidiol, CBD, oral solution for the treatment of seizures associated with two rare and severe forms of epilepsy. This is the first FDA-approved drug that contains a purified drug substance derived from marijuana. This approval serves as a reminder that advancing sound development programs that properly evaluate active ingredients contained in marijuana can lead to important medical therapies, and the FDA is committed to this kind of careful scientific research and drug development. Interesting, isn't it? Actually, it opened the floodgates for today and CBD use. The FDA, the one who had been working so hard to tell everybody how bad marijuana was, all of a sudden saw the light. Wonder if they were smoking some of that medical research marijuana grown for the U.S. government. So, as we enter the second half of 2021, CBD is available for sale in most states. And Big Pharma, for now, is out of the picture as people discover and rediscover the many benefits of cannabinoids. A recent survey of seniors found that a whopping 78% of seniors supported the use of CBD and other cannabinoids. We have come full circle from the first medical use of marijuana thanks to a revolution by states and individuals against Big Pharma and the federal government. It was a revolution worth fighting. Today, millions can benefit from this amazing herb, and they don't have to pay pharmaceutical companies outlandish fees to receive the full benefits of the plant. So there you have it, the history of marijuana as medicine. I hope you enjoyed the presentation.